Are you basically suggesting that this war, which started on October 7th, is not over yet?
I think it's far from over. If Israel gets tired of fighting against its enemies, then there is no more Israel.
Welcome back to the JNS Media Hub here in Jerusalem. My name is Alex Trayman. I'm the CEO and Jerusalem Bureau Chief of JNS Jewish News Syndicate, and we're here with a dear friend, Colonel Richard Kemp, who was a commander in Iraq and Afghanistan for the British Army, and has been involved in securing the Middle East, in dealing with the Israeli military, dealing with the British military. You've been in Gaza several times, I believe, since October 7th, and you provide, I think, some unique views and some moral clarity that you don't necessarily see from too many other members of the military around the world. So, Richard, we're glad to have you here. Thank you for doing what you do, and welcome back to Jerusalem.
Thank you, Alex. It's a real pleasure to join you again.
Well, I think the issue of the biggest concern for people here in the Middle East is Iran. The prime minister just went to Washington for what appeared to be an emergency visit. The president seems to want to engage in negotiations with the Iranian regime, but it feels like the United States and Israel and Iran are marching towards war. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about negotiations with the Iranians, if that's possible. The Iranian negotiating culture. What does that look like?
Yeah, I think, the main reason why there is a necessity for negotiations on the part of President Trump is because, of course, he is running a Western democracy, and he needs to take the people of that democracy, and certainly his supporters on the Republican side, with him in whatever it is he does of a major nature, particularly a warlike nature. So it's necessary, whatever his ultimate intention is, and only he can know that, it's necessary to go through this negotiation process. And I think he genuinely would like to achieve some kind of a deal with Iran, short of having to go to war. But that would, I think, be very unlikely to happen, because if there's to be any substantive deal, then it must be verifiable, and it must involve very significant actions on the part of Iran, like ending their nuclear weapons program, like certainly severely curtailing their ballistic missile program, if not ending it as well.
But haven't we seen deals? I mean, first of all, the Iranians were signatories to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and they proliferated. And then President Obama signed the JCPOA, which wasn't totally verifiable, but even we know that they were developing illicit nuclear weapons even after signing that deal. So how many times did the Iranians get to sign a deal before you get the idea that any deal that they sign is not worth the paper it's printed on?
Well, I would say that is an absolute fact, that no deal that Iran signs is worth the paper it's printed on. And that's why there's an element, I think, of theater in this, because President Trump knows that just as well as you and I know that. But of course, there is the likelihood of Iran signing a substantive deal with verification, whether they intend to adhere to it or not, is very low, because not only does it, in fact, what it does is it shows them to be weak. They're buckling under pressure of U.S. military presence and President Trump's threats. But I think there's an element of performance in this, and I just hope, and I have quite a lot of confidence in President Trump. I certainly hope that he doesn't end up with coming to some performative agreement which allows him then to withdraw his forces. I think that would be a real tragedy for Israel and for the Middle East and for the world.
That would be a major victory for Iran.
It would be a
Is
major.
that what they're hoping for? They're saying, hey, wait a second, the president of the United States, he's moving all this, what he calls a massive armada. There's aircraft carriers.
Beautiful armada.
Right. But really, he doesn't want to use it. He's a paper tiger. He actually is desperate for a deal, right? Isn't that empowering to the Iranians?
It is. And I disagree with people. Some of my close friends say that the Iranians are master negotiators and they're the best negotiators in the world. I don't agree with that. I think, okay, they're fine. I'm sure they do their best, but they're dealing normally, and I hope it's not the case with the current American administration, but they're normally dealing with people who are weak negotiators, who will do anything to try and appease and to come to an agreement, and that plays right into their hands. So it's not them that are the great negotiators; it's generally us who are the poor negotiators.
I mean, one could make an argument that Obama, when he entered into the JCPOA, the original Iran nuclear deal in 2015, that wasn't actually a negotiation at all. That was what that's what Obama wanted to do.
Absolutely, and Prime Minister Netanyahu was very clear about that and went to the United States, spoke in the Congress, making that exact point. And we saw the consequence of that. We saw that Iran went along with this so-called deal and broke it every single step of the way.
The 2026 JNS International Policy Summit will take place April 15 to 17 at the Waldorf Astoria in Jerusalem. Register today at jns-summit.org and use the coupon code JNSTV, that is JNSTV in one word, to receive 20% off all tickets. I look forward to seeing you in Jerusalem. I think there is actually a parallel between what happened in 2015 when Netanyahu went to Congress to argue against the original Iran nuclear deal and what we just saw this week, because again, Netanyahu came in an emergency meeting to express his opposition to any kind of a deal. He laid out the conditions for what a deal needed to look like. I believe he passed evidence to the president to demonstrate that the Iranians are continuing to proliferate nuclear weapons, that they are continuing to build up ballistic missiles, and certainly that they have been murdering protesters in the streets of Iran. But I think the difference here you could see is how the president welcomed Netanyahu and actually wanted to consider his view on this and didn't see it as a threat to his rule as the leader of the free world, the way that President Obama did in 2015.
Yeah, and I didn't see that meeting in Washington as an emergency meeting. I saw it as a stage of coordination before a potential attack or with a potential attack in view. And I don't think Netanyahu went there in order to persuade Trump to attack. I think Trump knows his own mind. Netanyahu probably has a clearer idea than most of us what's in Trump's mind. And I think it was more a matter of coordination and emphasis on certain issues rather than actually trying to push him down a certain road.
One thing that we're not necessarily hearing explained on the macro level to the West and the United States and maybe across Europe is, just how malign an actor Iran has been, how they have destabilized the entire region, and what removing the regime of the Ayatollahs, the Islamic Republic, what that would do for the region and for world peace. Maybe you can tell me from your view, how important you think this is strategically, and what would be the effects of removing the Ayatollahs and returning Iran back to its people.
Well, I think there's a number of different options there. And the first one is that you have a change of regime and a replacement by some kind of administration that actually is opposite to the current one. In other words, it doesn't seek war. It doesn't seek the annihilation of Israel. It doesn't seek death to America, but it actually wants to be a cooperative player in the Middle East. And that obviously is the primary and the most preferential outcome. Of course, there are other outcomes as well, and they could include complete chaos and a breakdown of law and order, significant breakdown of law and order, maybe Syria-style civil war even in Iran. There are so many different competing factions. I think those are the kind of best and worst case scenarios. But if the best case scenario applies, then it could change the whole of the Middle East, fundamentally change the Middle East and remove a huge amount of the reason why there's such violence and aggression across the Middle East. And I think, incidentally, I think countries like Saudi Arabia and some of the other countries that have kind of publicly opposed a U.S. military strike on Iran, I don't think they really, that's what they're saying publicly. I think they have a different perspective privately.
And why would they be saying it publicly?
Well, they have different agendas to cater for in their own countries with their people that they need to do business with, etc. outside. And I think, as with many countries, I was going to say with most Arab countries, but many countries around the world, what people say publicly is very often different to what they really want to achieve.
I mean, have you experienced this firsthand?
Many times. I mean, in all my dealings with countries in the Middle East, it's exactly the same. And I was in Saudi Arabia myself a couple of years ago now, and again before the signing of the Abraham Accords, and publicly, at that time, Saudi was still being quite venomous towards Israel, but beneath the surface, senior officials that I spoke to in the country had a very different story to tell. And their biggest concern, they said, the reason why there's such animosity towards Israel is because they have to placate their people. And I pointed out to them, they didn't need me to point it out to them, but I did, that actually the only reason why their people are so have such animosity towards Israel is because they've been educated in that way. And it's a question. It's all.
It's a chicken and an egg, right?
Sorry,
it's a chicken and an egg.
It is a chicken and egg.
And what is the value of a peace or a normalization that takes place at the upper levels if the street does not come around to view the normalization with Israel as a positive for the society?
Yeah, absolutely. And the power of the street in countries like Saudi Arabia, I think you should question, because countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, other Arab countries are they maintain pretty close control on their streets, and you often hear of, oh, if Israel does this or if the US does that, the Arab street will rise up. Well, how often does that really happen?
I mean, shouldn't this whole process of normalization being taking place in backwards? Like first, the regimes in place should be, calming the tensions regarding Israel and saying, "Hey, yeah, for sure, we understand. We would prefer that this would be all Muslim territory, but the Jews are here. It's the will of Allah, and we need to be hospitable towards them in some way." And quite frankly, they bring a lot of solutions to the region that wouldn't exist, if they were not here. But nobody is saying that.
Yeah, I think it's if anything, it has to be. I think in the Arab world, it has to be very incremental.
Mhm.
And there are signs in various different Arab countries of that attempts at incremental change by the governments of those countries. But it doesn't really always work. And if you look at, for example, the peace agreement between Egypt and
Exactly.
Israel. I mean, the Egyptian government, by and large, and I know there are exceptions, by and large are very cooperative with Israel. They work in common a lot, but there is absolute venom on the streets of Cairo, for example, against Israel.
And can that lead at some point potentially to war? Potentially, if another leader comes in, a populist leader comes in, he sees, well, the street, we all hate Israel over here, and this government which we just threw out, they were collaborating, with the enemy, and now we're going to tear up this peace treaty that we signed because the people, they don't understand the value of it.
There's always that possibility, I think, probably in any country, but I'd say particularly in the Middle East. And that's one reason why it's such a turbulent region. And it's one reason why Israel cannot ever let up its guard, because even if it's, let's say there's a regime change in Iran, things work out great. There appears to be a lot more kind of friendly relations across the region between Israel and Arab countries and Iran. Suddenly that could change almost overnight. And Israel, therefore, because of Israel's unique position, Israel has to keep its guard up all of the time and forever.
I mean, countries like the Saudis, for example, probably also are not saying publicly that they want to see Israel or the United States affect regime change in Iran because the Iranians are very unpredictable and they could retaliate all over the Middle East. And the Saudis don't want to be the target of a retaliation, just as the Qataris don't want to be a target of retaliation. But you see through this how the Iranians have actually destabilized the entire region, right? The Houthis have been attacking the Saudis from Yemen, and there's now instability between the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates over the Houthis, and you have Iraq, you have Syria. Like, maybe you can tell us, as someone who spent so much time in the region, just what kind of influence Iran has had over the entirety of this Middle East.
Well, Iran has been an extremely bad player right the way back to 1979. as far as the whole Middle East is concerned. And I mean, it's only very recently that the Iranian government has actually taken things into their own hands by directly attacking Israel. Up until then, it was all done through proxies. And they have such an extraordinary proxy network, or shall we say they used to have such an extraordinary proxy network, primarily, I'd say Lebanese Hezbollah and Hamas, of course, the Houthis as well, to a lesser extent, but to a significant extent, Iraq, and less so nowadays in Syria. But yeah, I mean, the whole region was infested with Iranian evildoing through a phenomenal proxy network, which was severely damaged. I think severely damaged initially when the United States killed Qasem Soleimani, the head of the IRGC Quds force.
During the Trump administration's first term.
Right. That did a great deal of damage to the whole of the proxy network. It wasn't irreparable, as the damage Israel has done to it since the 7th of October 2023, which has been, in my view, is irreparable.
Yeah, maybe
Iran
you can
try and resurrect it, but they're going to have their work cut out for them.
Right. It seems like Iran is severely weakened right now, and that its position is both in terms of its proxy network, in terms of its air defenses in the country, but also in terms of its domestic support. I mean, this is a regime that's on the ropes. Does that make it more dangerous?
I'm not sure it does make it more dangerous. I think it's certain. I mean, there's every possibility that Iran could lash out, but we've seen Iran lash out before, and it lashed out at Israel twice last year, and we saw what limited effect that had. It obviously did a certain amount of damage in Israel, and unfortunately, a number of people were killed, but nothing like the danger that people expected from Iran. And right now, during this period of heightened tension, we've got one United States aircraft carrier strike group in the region, another on the way, numerous other American systems in place, which will, I think, if Iran does decide to lash out in this period when it's under greatest danger, I think it will be contained relatively effectively. That doesn't mean there won't be any danger.
So back to negotiations, then it seems like it is most definitely in Iran's best interest to reach some kind of negotiated settlement, specifically because we know that they usually don't keep the terms of the deal that they sign, but this would give them the time to sort of rebuild support inside the country, rebuild some of their proxy infrastructure, or at least just try to wait out President Trump, because I mean, he's only going to be in office for 3 more years. If they can figure out a way to sign a deal, placate, build a little bit, but then come back towards him and just hold him at bay, he's not going to be president in another 3 years from now. And then another president might look like a Biden, might look like an Obama or Kamala Harris, or on the other side might be one of these isolationists in the United States is not going to want to deal with Iran no matter how malign they're being. So it would seem that it would be in Iran's interest to race towards a deal.
I think in some respects that's right. Although, as I mentioned earlier, backing down to the United States and making concessions to the US is in itself a sign of weakness, which might provoke the reemergence of some of these oppositionists, maybe more effective this time than last time. So there's a danger in going either way for Iran. But I think I would say that the other danger that Iran has to contemplate is Israel. Because even if the United States decides not to strike Iran, that doesn't prevent Israel from striking Iran. And I think Israel really has an obligation to strike Iran if the US doesn't. I think the nuclear program has been not totally destroyed, but very largely dismantled. And I don't think that's a threat, certainly not a near-term threat, probably not even a medium-term threat anymore. But the ballistic missiles remain a big threat. And so I think Israel has an obligation, whether or not a U.S. strike, to strike Iran itself. And Iran knows this.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that 12-day war, because Israel took out, like you said, most of the nuclear facilities, and obviously the United States came in at the end with the Midnight Hammer. They sent the B-2 bombers, they bombed Fordo, but there was a feeling, a sense at the time that Israel could have potentially kept going, that there were more targets. At the same time, Iran was continuing to send ballistic missiles directly into Israel. And we were seeing that there were increasing percentages of ballistic missiles that struck within the country. So maybe you can talk a little bit about this balance of why Israel stopped when it did, if it should have gone forward. And then maybe we can talk also about the Israeli intelligence and where that might be today versus where it was back in June.
Yeah, I think I don't know this for sure, but my estimation is that had Israel had a free hand, it would have carried on against Iran. I think it would have proceeded for longer. But of course, Prime Minister Netanyahu has to balance those sort of concerns and that desire with the United States and what President Trump wanted. He's not under Trump's thumb, but it's important that the balance is maintained between the two countries, which is, I think, in a almost perfect situation now, and has been since Trump came back into the White House. So I think the balance was Trump obviously didn't want to go further. Trump felt that he could stand up and say that he had smashed the Iranian nuclear program, which was his objective in that. And Netanyahu was willing to go along with that for the time being.
But Trump was probably hopeful that that would have been the last military intervention in Iran, that was going to be the end of the story. And now we see here about 6-7 months later that we're on the cusp of potentially another military intervention.
Yeah, this is so often the way. And it happened also, let's say, in the first Gulf War, when the US and its allies decided to stop short of actually bringing down the regime in Baghdad, with the expectation that this would clip Saddam Hussein's wings. It didn't work out that way, and the US again and their allies had to go back in a second time. So you can decide what you think is the optimum solution at the time, but events then unfold, and you may have to do something differently.
Back in June, the feeling was not to take out Khamenei, even though you get the sense that between Israel and the United States, if Khamenei had been a target, if they had wanted him to be a target, that they could have struck and removed him. Do you think that any military intervention now could avoid removing Khamenei from power?
I would guess that the primary objective of any particularly US military intervention now will be to remove Khamenei from power, and he will be the primary target, personally the primary target of any attack, as well as sort of maybe second, third tier, and maybe even lower levels of the Iranian regime and the IRGC, etc.
Yeah,
That'll be the absolute priority now.
let's talk a little bit about the IRGC, because this isn't just a one-man show. It's not just an Ayatollah. There's Basij, internal security forces. There's the IRGC. This is one of the few countries where the military is not necessarily geared towards fighting outside enemies. The military is specifically in place to keep the population in check. Can you take out Ayatollah and maybe a second or a third level and believe then that the IRGC would just turn over a new leaf?
No, absolutely not. I think you have to demolish at least the hierarchy, the upper echelons of the IRGC, and many of their sort of institutions and installations within Iran as well. You've got to do severe damage to the IRGC. The next question arising from that is what kind of replaces the current regime, and I think from my understanding inside Iran there is a disparate group of oppositionists, some of whom are opposed to each other, some of whom work together, but to my knowledge, none of them have the real power to take down the regime. But maybe they will if the US does a good job along with Israel on the regime. But I think probably again, I'm not really a major expert on the internal workings of Iran, but my understanding is that the only real element that could take control of Iran from the Ayatollah and the IRGCs is the Iranian army, which, as I understand, is not overly loyal to the regime. Obviously, they have to go along with them, but I think there is greater loyalty, perhaps, among certain elements within the Iranian army towards the Shah's son, who obviously is being talked about as a potential, at least figurehead in a new regime. So I think probably the Iranian army poses the greatest threat to the IRGC inside Iran. But of course, the Ayatollahs and their people know very well about that and will be doing their best to prevent it.
Do you think that some of this delay in launching a military strike, either by Israel or the United States, or as is probably most likely a joint military operation, that this delay is in part due to um, the the attempts on the ground to make sure that the people that you need to sort of defect or that you're going to rely on for transition, that they're working on making those shifts right now before they strike?
I would be extremely surprised if that wasn't the case. And I think a great deal of preparation and groundwork has been going on by the United States and Israel and potentially other allies as well to try and create the conditions now which allow for some kind of effective regime change and the replacement by something other than chaos. So yeah, I think a huge amount of work's going on behind the scenes on all of that now.
Now we have to imagine that if there is a military intervention, that there will be some degree of retaliation, as we saw during the 12-day war. Iran launched hundreds of ballistic missiles directly at Israel. There's also the threat of potential retaliation from Hezbollah to Israel's north in Lebanon. Do you see Hezbollah becoming involved in retaliating against military intervention in Iran? And what would that obligate Israel to do in terms of finishing off whatever capabilities remain in Lebanon?
Well, I think there has to be an assumption on the part of Israel that there is going to be a significant threat from Hezbollah. Of course, Israel's done immense damage to Hezbollah, including the incredible pager operation, or bleepers, whatever you want to call it, and Israeli air and ground operations as well. So Hezbollah has been badly weakened, but not beyond the possibility of lashing out in a pretty effective way against Israel. So yes, Israel has to assume that's going to happen, and Israel has to take action, I would say, either immediately before or at the same time as a potential strike on Iran. I mean, Israel's been hammering away at Hezbollah pretty much every day or many days since the supposed ceasefire there. But I think we're talking about a much more intensive operation against Hezbollah should the U.S. decide to strike Iran.
Do you think there's a possibility that other countries like the British could get involved, at least on a defensive level, to try to block or intercept ballistic missiles or drones being fired at Israel, either from Lebanon or from Iran?
Yeah, the British were involved in, as well as other countries, of course, in the defense of Israel against the attacks at the beginning of, in April, I think it was 2025. And we have now deployed a number of Tornado, I think, aircraft into Qatar as part of a defensive shield should Israel lash out. So I would see Britain and other allies helping in the defense of not just Israel, but also other countries in the Middle East if either Iran or the Houthis or whatever decide to lash out.
What about in an offensive capacity?
I don't think so. I think that's most unlikely. I think while Britain is willing to, and I think Britain's involvement in defending against Iran is probably more the result of pressure from the United States rather than their own willingness to do so. They're obviously, I think they will do so. It's a very limited thing. I think it's something like, I don't know, 6 airplanes or something like that. But that's probably the limit of their tolerance for getting involved in these conflicts. The big problem the UK has, as well as other European countries, is that in Britain we have a very weak government at the moment, which its priority is shoring itself up against quite a large element of its current supporters who are very vehemently anti-Israel. And so they need to strike that balance between actually doing what the US wants them to do and trying to keep calm at home.
If Netanyahu can't even really fly now to Great Britain or to France or to other countries in Europe without threat of being arrested.
Yeah, it's absolutely shocking and disgraceful. And of course we have actually seen attempts to arrest Israeli politicians and military people in the UK previously, not in relation to the recent activities. But, that says everything you need to know, in my view, about the state of Europe today.
Well, obviously, they're upset about Israel's conduct inside Gaza. You've been inside Gaza many times. Can you relate to the accusations of war crimes, the accusations of genocide, the accusations of famine as a policy of fighting the war versus what you saw with your own eyes inside the Gaza Strip?
I mean, the first thing I'd say is that I don't believe that governments like the UK government or the French government or the Germans or any of the others are upset by what Israel's done. I don't. Yes, they say it comes back to this business about a government saying something but thinking something differently. They know how Israel's been operating. They have people over here. They have military people here, Britain, France, Germany. They have military. They have intelligence people over here. They know exactly how Israel's operated. The only reason they accuse Israel of war crimes and go along with that charade is, as I said, to placate their anti-Israel population. Not that the whole population is anti-Israel, but certainly the supporters of, for example, the UK Labour Party. Many of them are anti-Israel. All of their actions, like partial arms embargo, like recognition of a non-existent Palestinian state, that wasn't anything to do with what's happening in the region. It's all to do with keeping its supporters happy. And they know the reality. They say something differently, but they know the reality. And in response to your question about how I see it and how I've seen what's happening, I absolutely refute allegations of genocide, of starvation, of deliberate killing of innocent civilians, all of those things. I've seen with my own eyes exactly what Israel's done, and Israel's done its best to destroy Hamas while minimizing the deaths of innocent civilians. It's very difficult to do that, and it's actually impossible to do that in these circumstances where you not only have Hamas hiding it within the civilian population and fighting from the civilian population, but determined to get Israel to kill its own civilians. And that makes it doubly difficult when they set things up in that way. And yet Israel's done everything it can. And people who say to me, which many people do say to me, Israel must do it differently. And I always say, well, okay, how? How should Israel do it? Military experts, academics, none of them can ever say how Israel could destroy or defeat Hamas and minimize or not kill innocent civilians.
Unless they don't want Israel to kill Hamas, because they want Hamas to continue to attack Israel. But I want to go back to the British position and the European position. I mean, you're saying that they understand what's happening, that they're actually not disappointed in what Israel's doing, but they have to placate their street. I mean, aren't these European countries, right? I mean, it's not all Muslim fundamentalists in the UK. Where is the moral courage and clarity to stand up and to say, hey, we represent truth. We support Israel, even if you don't like them. There's a reason to it. And do they really understand how much damage they do to Israel's strategic position to be able to carry out these wars if they continue to undermine Israel's position in international forums?
And it's not just damage to Israel; it's damage to us as well, because if Israel does not succeed, for example, in Gaza and eventually get rid of Hamas altogether, then that is a means of incitement among jihadists globally, including in the UK. So Israel's fight is actually the fight for the Western world. And I think they do understand it. But politicians, by and large, I'm sure the same applies in every country in the world, they look 4 years ahead. They look to the next election, whenever it might be. And their priority is not strategic. It's not any of the bigger picture stuff. It's all to do with winning votes in the next election. And that's why they think in the way they do, because you're right. I mean, the majority of British people, ordinary, decent British people, I'm convinced, are on the side of Israel. Okay, they struggle to be on the side of Israel because they're being brainwashed by the likes of the BBC, who are vehemently opposed to Israel, and other, particularly broadcast media in the UK. But the big problem is for the Labour Party, which, as I mentioned, is in a very weak position now for various reasons. They had a big wake-up call at the last general election when I think something like 4 independent MPs standing on a Gaza platform in a British election, believe it or not, won seats in Parliament. And those are MPs and constituencies who could traditionally be relied upon to support Labour. Now, that was just the beginning. They see that expanding dramatically in the next election, potentially doing real political damage to them as a party, and that's their priority.
Uh, but really, what's actually happening is you're almost guaranteeing that in a few years from now, there won't be anybody in the UK that supports Israel because they just are hearing it from their government, they're hearing it from the BBC, they're hearing it from the street. So you're basically going to find that with regard to Israel, at least, that the UK is not going to be any different than Egypt or Saudi Arabia.
Well, if that position is allowed to continue to evolve, yes. There are political parties now in the UK who stand up against that position. Not, I don't think specifically for support of Israel directly, but in support of the kind of values that Israel stands for, and that the the ordinary, decent, indigenous British people stand for, and many of the immigrants as well stand for. Those parties are beginning to arise, which is potentially, we'll have to see, because the British political system does not lend itself to, unlike Israel, to a new party emerging every 5 minutes and actually achieving anything. So we'll have to see. But I think there is a certain amount of pushback now, despite the fact that so many of these forces, like the BBC and like the Labour Party in particular, and a Conservative Party, supposedly right-wing party, which is more closely aligned with Labour than it is with anything else, despite all of those forces built against them, still the ordinary people in Britain, I think, see the reality and understand the reality. I think the big thing that we sometimes mistake is thinking that because we see thousands and thousands of people out on the streets of London week after week after week during the war protesting, that's the voice of Britain. It isn't. It's a minority of the people in Britain. The majority, unfortunately, remain silent.
Let's take the conversation back to Gaza for a minute, and everything is intertwined, right? So, Prime Minister Netanyahu's considerations when dealing with President Trump over Iran also have to relate to what the president wants to do in Gaza and how the president has actually taken a lot of the responsibility for the future of Gaza, the rebuilding in Gaza, off of the shoulders of Prime Minister Netanyahu. And I think a lot of people don't understand just how important that is to Israel, that the United States says, hey, we're taking care of the situation. Don't lean on Israel to fix it. We're taking it. That's very important. And now we're starting to see how Trump has put this board of peace into place, and that we might see an international stabilization force be deployed in Gaza. They're talking potentially about 8,000, up to, I read, 8,000 soldiers from Indonesia deploying inside Gaza. What would be the mandate of an international stabilization force? What would they be expected to accomplish? What would they not be expected to accomplish?
I mean, I think the benefit of the Board of Peace and Trump's peace agreement are extremely significant, as you kind of outlined there. I think it's very important that the burden of, let's say, the future of Gaza is taken to an extent off Israel's shoulders. But I don't see anyone dealing with Hamas. If Hamas is going to be finished off and is no longer going to have a function in Gaza, then there's only one organization that can do that, and that's the IDF. It's not 8,000 Indonesian soldiers. They're not going to go in and fight against Hamas and disarm Hamas. They couldn't do it, for one thing, even if they had the political will to do it. Only the IDF can do that with their vast range of experience in fighting against Hamas, particularly over the last 2 years. And also the willingness of Israel to risk soldiers' lives. And many soldiers have died in this war, of course, as you know better than I do, because it's on their doorstep. Is Indonesia going to put soldiers in and risk killing a lot of Indonesians? No, I don't think so. So I think Israel's the only country that can really deal with Hamas militarily. And then a stabilization force is going to be maybe coming in afterwards to perform some kind of UN-type function inside.
So do you think it's likely that the IDF returns to war against Hamas? And then based on what you've seen and how Israel operated until now, how long would that take in order to finish Hamas down to the last teenager holding a rifle, a Kalashnikov?
I think it is likely that Israel will go back in, and the IDF will go back in and deal with Hamas, and unless Hamas caves, which to me seems extremely unlikely. They certainly say they're not going to disarm, and they're not going to kind of pull out of their current role in Gaza. But unless that happens, I don't see any alternative other than Israel going in, and I think they probably will, and that will be agreed with President Trump when the time comes. And as far as I don't know. I can't tell you how long it takes. All I can tell you, I think, is that it's going to be quite a different war from the war we've seen in Gaza so far. And the primary reason for it being different is that there are no longer any Israeli hostages in Gaza. That made a phenomenal difference to the way the IDF could operate. It did it slowed, the war. I don't believe that war would have lasted all the time it did if those hostages hadn't been there. And I think Israel can deal with Hamas. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be clean. Israeli soldiers are going to die, unfortunately. And a lot of Gaza civilians are probably going to die as well. Again, unfortunately.
Does Israel want to get back into a situation where Gazan civilians are dying because Hamas is hiding among the civilians? I mean, it seems like from Israel's perspective, being in a situation where Gazans are not dying as a result of Hamas's actions is a better position, right? What's the incentive now for Israel to go in, right? Hamas is somewhat contained. Israel controls 53% of the Gaza Strip. Fine, Hamas is running around. They have 60,000 guns. They're terrorizing their own society, but it doesn't really necessarily pose a threat to Israel because Israel's deployed to defend against that threat. If the war begins again, then the international community starts ramping up the diplomatic warfare in Israel. How important is it for Israel to go in and to completely dismantle Hamas at this point?
Well, we thought Hamas was contained on the 6th of October, and it turned out they weren't. And that was kind of the received wisdom, including among the Israeli security apparatus, that they didn't really pose a significant threat to Israel. And perhaps that's the thinking now. I don't know whether people in the Israeli security apparatus think like that or not. I suspect not, because they've learned a very significant lesson. But it's obviously Israel doesn't want to go in and do that and start ending up with more civilians dead, despite their efforts to try and prevent it. Obviously they don't. But while Hamas might be contained at the moment, and Israel might have increased its defenses at the moment, Hamas is not going to, unless Hamas is killed, it's not going to die. They're going to find a way, some way, of reinvigorating themselves, building up their capabilities more, and then striking back at Israel again in a way that maybe we can't even imagine at the moment.
So if you're looking at the current situation, what you see in Gaza, what you see in southern Lebanon, what you see in Iran, are you basically suggesting that this war, which started on October 7th, is not over yet?
I think it's far from over. And the other one you didn't mention is the Houthis, which still pose a significant threat, not just to international shipping, but also to Israel. And I think the key thing, and you kind of mentioned at the beginning, is the importance of Iran. And that will play a role, I think, if assuming that the regime is brought down, if it is, that will play a role in undermining Hamas. And I think, Hamas, the reason Hamas went along with the ceasefire agreement that Trump brokered, whenever it was, a few months back, was really twofold, threefold. One, the 12-day war, and how brought down Iran was by that war, how weakened they were, how they were visibly weakened. Two, the Israeli strikes on Qatar, which showed Qatar, it showed Hamas, it showed Turkey, and it showed the world that Israel is prepared to stop at nothing to deal with this enemy that wants to kill and has killed its own people. And thirdly, the sheer power of the IDF, which was, as you recall, had just begun operations to reduce Gaza City. And I think Hamas felt that this was going to be almost the last stand for them if it went ahead. So I think that those things together have brought us to where we are now. But it isn't over, and it's not going to be over until the head is chopped off the octopus in Iran, and those proxies that remain dangerous are dealt with.
Well, as you mentioned, Hamas has other backers aside from Iran. You have the Qataris, you have the Turks, and in a way, Hamas, which is made up of Sunni Muslims, not Shiite Muslims, are more aligned ideologically, with the Qataris, with the Turks, with the Egyptians, and Muslim Brotherhood than they are with the Shiite Ayatollahs in Iran. And I guess the question is, if you cut off this head of the terror octopus, which is Iran, are there other heads of this terror octopus, of a maybe a different octopus, waiting to fill the void left by Iran?
Yeah, there's always going to be that in this region. You're never going to get rid of that threat, that real possibility, and that's why I said earlier that Israel has to maintain its guard, has to keep its guard up all the time, because these things will emerge, and there are countries, no matter what happens, there are countries that have very, very dangerous intent towards Israel. And I think a key thing that we can't forget, and that's why, in my view, this current phase of the war, shall we say, has to be finished as decisively and as quickly as possible, is because the United States remains a key player, and who knows what's going to be the position in the United States at the end of the Trump administration.
And as a member of the British military, maybe you can relate a little bit towards military fatigue, especially in a country that is a democracy, right? And the threat to Israel, if they get tired of fighting against Hamas, if they get tired of fighting against Iran, if they get tired of potentially fighting against a Turkey or an Egypt in the future, what are those stakes?
Well, if Israel gets tired of fighting against its enemies, then there is no more Israel. But I don't see any sign of that or likelihood of that. I mean, Israel's been fighting basically for its survival in its current form since 1948, and I think will continue to fight. And let's hope that we have, at the end of this phase of conflict, we have at least a bit of
Respite.
respite, yeah, before the next major threat arises. But I have to say, I've heard many people say during various stages during the war, the recent war, that the IDF is tired. They've had enough. They don't want to fight. The people in Israel don't want to fight. I've seen absolutely no evidence of that. Obviously, they don't want to fight. Of course, no one wants to fight, but they know they have to fight in order to survive. And so I think no matter what, the spirit of Israeli people and their leaders is such that you're never going to get to the point where they say, well, enough is enough. Let's put our hands up and get on the cattle trucks.
Richard Kemp, thank you so much for
Thank
being with us.
Thank you.